Hi, thanks so much all of you for your patience in joining us for this live session for week 6 of our massive open online course. So we're thrilled to be here with Professors Ken Giller and William Masters, and we're going to be talking about smallholder farmers. Will, over to you.
Yeah, so I'm joining from Boston, Massachusetts, Tufts University, and really delighted that all of participants in the course and those who joined the call now or watching the recording later, interested in this topic of how agriculture and sustainable agriculture, inclusive agriculture, can contribute to poverty reduction in the developing world. We're, I'm really privileged, lucky to be able to have this conversation and for all of the course participants to have this dialogue across different kinds of disciplines, people with experience in different places. My own field work, mostly in Southern Africa, the area just ravaged by the cyclone. And as participants in the course, if you've had a chance to look at the really nice video blog post that Ken was able to upload from Mali, we have a sense of engagement, what's going on in the Sahel region. So I wanted to just start by asking Ken to give us sort of his impressions after having recorded that video blog and the various other sort of fieldwork activities you've been engaged with in the Sahel. Does the evolution of farming systems and agriculture towards facing climate change, facing demographic pressure, facing political challenges, conflict in some regions, are you basically optimistic, basically pessimistic? How are you feeling? What are you seeing? Can you give us a sense of the trajectory that these communities are on?
Yeah, thanks, Will. And yeah, really good to be online with you today. So I was in Mali, in southern Mali, in this area of the cotton zone of Mali in the south just a couple of weeks ago. And I did that recording in the field. It was quite a shock, actually, because, of course, 37 degrees there. And then last week I was in Oslo. So, I mean, you think, wow, what a difference. But one of the nice things there, one of the things that really struck me was that we really saw in that zone a lot of farmers, for instance, doing stall feeding of cattle, where they were producing milk for the market. And this is something that we'd worked on 10 years or more back, where we really felt that the whole market situation really didn't lend itself to that actually being a technology that would be taken up. And then you go back 10 years later, and all of a sudden you find everybody doing it. And of course, in between, there have been NGOs active and the like, and we've actually had continuing activities. But it's really nice to be able to go back with those snapshots in time and actually see, yeah, I think very positive change going on. Whether I'm optimistic or not, well, maybe that's another question. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is extraordinary to have that that time horizon where you've been able to return to field sites and track the changes in as you say, market conditions and then farm technologies, where one of the big stories is, I think, this increasing integration of crops and livestock, where Africa was the, I think, only major world region where most manure was lost because it was because animals were grazing in the open, and the nutrient cycling was the nutrient cycling that prevailed elsewhere in the world wasn't being, the nutrient flows were not being captured and recycled in the way that the stall feeding. Can you speak a little bit about the soil fertility aspects of the stall feeding? Sure. You mentioned the market aspects. What's going on with soils?
Well, I mean, yeah, there are a few things I'd like to add. I mean, one is, of course, that in those areas, it's an interesting one where there have been very long-term parastatal support through the CMDT, as it's called, the government parastatal, which actually works around the cotton value chain. And farmers have been able to access inputs through the cotton value chain. And we see very clear effects of farmers. They receive inputs, particularly fertilizers, seed and the like, through doing cotton, and also some for maize. And that fertilizer is actually then used within the farming system much broader than on the cotton. And farmers actually manage their rotations strategically to grow cotton and then to rotate it with other crops, which then benefit is very much targeted to maize and to cotton in the system, and then they tend to grow the other staple crops like sorghum and millet on those fields afterwards, benefiting from that residual soil fertility. Maybe if I could just reflect back again on this idea of trajectories of change, because in that area of southern Mali,
Signal has frozen. I've actually lost Ken. I don't know if others have.
Is that there was clear progression of many farmers really doing better, accumulating more cattle. As they accumulated wealth, they were investing that in cattle, so they'd have more manure as well, but more traction. But what we did see is that the poorer farmers, the farmers who started poor, actually remained poor, and they remained poor all the way through. Yeah.
At a level of 0 cattle, or even because a herd of 2 or 3 was not sufficient?
Yeah, more in, say, goats and sheep, but not really getting, you didn't really see this idea that everybody was taking off.
Yes.
It was very much that the poorer, they stayed rocking around, you know, still fairly poor, and the better off households in the community generally were doing better and better. So we actually have this big question at the moment as to whether or not, you know, the intensifications that we make really increase or decrease equity. You know, if we say that equity is one of the core values of sustainability, then we find that nearly everything we do, it's very, very hard for that to really reach the poor in the community. And I think that's something that you and I've discussed, I know, in the past. Yeah.
Yeah, and really striking how whenever there's a technological improvement or an opportunity in the market that rests on some particular asset, and it comes down to the social institutions and the policy environment enabling inclusive participation, where things that are based on livestock require a large livestock herd, things that are based on land require land property rights, and there's a huge gender dimension often to that.
Yeah,
I'm curious about
part of the sustainable intensification that we saw in Mali when I was there is that cowpea, which is of course an important grain legume, is also being used very much for fodder, and that is really taking off in that with a market for fodder as well. So a market for fodder to be actually sold within the community and actually shared with being shared with farmers also in the city, so that there are stall-fed cattle actually in the nearby city, and quite trucks of donkey carts going into the city actually carrying the cowpea residue with them, which is the cowpea then being used for feeding animals there. So you see many of these different little sort of dynamic things starting to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, and as this dynamic multi-product integrated crop livestock system evolves, I wonder if you can comment a little bit on complementarity and also potentially substitution or conflict between.
Are you still there?
I hope you can hear me. Between the organic matter in the system, including the manure flows, and the green manure, the fan de fonio, the crop leaves. As opposed to inorganic fertilizers. Ken, if you can hear me, I'm really curious to hear your sense of the interplay between those, and whether the two are really complements, where organic matter in the soil is being built up so that inorganic fertilizers have a higher impact, or whether there's a trade-off between the two. In other words, does organic and inorganic go together, or is there a trade-off?
You know, sorry, I mean, it looks as if I've got some problems with connectivity here. I had to switch from my laptop because we couldn't hear each other properly. but the signal keeps dropping away actually for me. So I'm afraid I missed half of your question there, Will. I'm afraid.
So I was asking about the potential synergy, the dynamism, as you were talking about dynamic change in the system between soil fertility from organic fertilizers, both manures and the and green manures, and the application of inorganic fertilizer. Do you see these two going together? Is soil quality improving in these zones?
I think it's definitely true that there are definite. I think you're asking about whether there are synergies between the use of the organic resources and the mineral resources. And
exactly,
it's very clear that there's a very strong targeting by farmers of those resources to different parts of the farm and onto specific crops. Yeah. And it's really clear as well from work there, but also elsewhere, that whereas the fertilizers are often really just focusing in Africa, they're often very simple blends, largely with just nitrogen and phosphorus, that the manure is really important for adding some of the other nutrients that obviously crops need to be able to actually grow really well. So the combination of the two is really definitely a real advantage to smallholders. What I'd like to pick up on as well is, I mean, of course, one of the issues that we had in Mali is of course, there's been this terrible problem of insecurity in the north, and that's really having big effects in the country, which have, I mean, really affecting people further north, although in the south things are still fairly stable and going okay. But obviously, we've got this issue of demography and the rise in the population and population density. And I'd be interested to know your take on this, Will. But I see it in two ways. In one way, it's creating demand, it's creating markets for fodder, for livestock, for milk, for crops, you know, and that's having a stimulating effect for smallholder production. But then, of course, on the other side, we see this increasing pressure on land. And whereas in Mali, maybe it's not so acute, but it means then that there's less and less grazing land, that more of the land's occupied. And it's harder and harder, you know, for people to graze their cattle. The areas of farmland available to households are declining. So you start to see this increasing pressure on the land. And it strikes me that there's a sort of it's a double-edged sword. It's cutting both ways. It's got its positive sides, but I think that there's a bigger looming threat in the longer term. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
Absolutely, and I think one really crucial point is that that's a common feature across Africa as a whole. So, in terms of agroecology and political circumstances and sort of markets, Africa is enormously diverse. But what almost the entire continent has in common is this shared demographic pathway, where the African, broadly speaking, demographic transition of very high fertility and mortality all through history to the 19th century and early 20th century, Africa was not, as a whole, Africa was not able to benefit from public health intervention until the 1960s, until independence, when mortality plummeted very fast, 30 or 40 years after it had fallen in the rest of the tropical world, and 150 or 200 years after it had begun to fall in the temperate world. As a result of which, African population growth, Africa's the last region of the world to experience rapid population growth, and it's doing that at a time when its cities are relatively small, urban and non-farm employment is relatively small, and where cities are relatively healthy, so children born in cities are growing up to take the available urban jobs, and so rural population growth in Africa as a whole is just extraordinarily unprecedented, extraordinarily high, and sustained over decades, likely to persist. Rural population growth and increase in rural population per area of land across the entire continent, and each different region, each different sub-region within countries experiencing that in very different ways. So some places able to have very rapid growth in youth employment in agriculture itself, with innovations around intensive cropping, horticulture, aquaculture, other kinds of ways of using labor in crop production or livestock production. And then elsewhere having rural non-farm employment being the main focus. But the basic idea that one thing so much of Africa has in common is this rise in rural populations who are often trying to find non-farm employment and to migrate to towns and cities, but experiencing very few opportunities because the available jobs in towns and cities are so often being taken by people who grew up within the town and city.
Yeah. So one graph of yours that really always sticks in my mind was a graph that you prepared, I remember, on FAO, based on FAO data, where you showed that irrespective of the size of farm, and sizes of farms going from like 1 hectare to 10 hectares to 100 to 1,000 hectares or more, that the number of people actually working those farms in terms of full-time labor actually stayed pretty constant, even though the size of farms went up and up and up. And of course, that's due to this substitution of manual labor through mechanization. But what that would tend to indicate is, of course, that agriculture doesn't necessarily create a huge number of jobs. So where does that leave us, really, with that idea that you're talking about of, people wanting to, young people in the cities taking the jobs that are available? So where does that leave us with this whole question of youth in agriculture in relation to smallholder production?
Yeah, so that is an absolutely extraordinary fact about the agri-food system, is that the vast majority of crop production is done by family farms. So that chart that Ken, you were referring to, distinguishes between family members and full-time hired workers who might be employed by an investor-owned farm. And the observation is that everywhere in the world, from the tiniest rice farm in Taiwan to the largest rice farm in Mississippi of the United States, to a rice farm in the Senegal River Valley in West Africa, they're all family operations. And similarly, whether it's a cotton farm in the south of the United States or a cotton farm in Mali, it's a family operation. In the United States, it might be 500 hectares and a millionaire cotton farmer, whereas in Mali, it might be a smallholder operation, much lower level of income. Similarly, thinking of grain farms, you go from Australia at 20 or 30,000 hectares to Argentina, to Africa, and you'd see the full range. And in all these cases, it's a family operation. So the number of workers is the family members. Of course, in the Sahel, family sizes are quite large, often with extended family members who may not actually even be blood relatives, but join the household to have a household compound of 20, 30, 40 people, in parts of the Sahel. Whereas in as fertility rates fall, you might have just 2 or 3 family members working on the farm. So it really comes down to inclusive agricultural growth and having the farm population gain access to the farm resources, whether land is distributed, access to land is equitable, access to grazing resources equitable, and then for those who don't have ownership of livestock or land, are there access to rural non-farm employment in the sense of agricultural trading activities, agro-processing, and retailing and services in the rural areas. So it becomes a really crucial issue whether rural development is managed in an inclusive manner if Africa's increasingly scarce land is controlled by, frankly, elites who, because they're members of a military or members related to individuals in government, or just have accumulated wealth, if they're able to hoard land and control land, then that rural population growth will be forced into landlessness, as it was in Asia, and of course in Latin America. So the stakes are very high for Africa to have a inclusive development pathway that absorbs this rural population growth in the family farms. It's an amazing story.
Well, so I know that one of the interventions that I've heard about from the African Development Bank and others is that they've been looking to fund what they call nucleus farms. So farms which would be larger, 100 hectares or more, with mechanization as a way of trying to sort of stimulate the rural economy and get the input and output markets going. So this idea of anchor farms or nucleus farms with then outgrowers around them who could actually then be assisted to join in the value chain that's then created from these larger farms. Do you have any thoughts on that as a development trajectory? Because it seems to be one that's gaining some prominence.
Yes, there's a long tradition throughout the 20th century of efforts to have agricultural development with nucleus and outgrower or anchor and periphery farms. And the story is fairly straightforward in that when there's a scale economy from some kind of machine, or often a transportation, a truck size has scale economies, or any agro-processing. So the most extreme cases are sugarcane, tea, and to a considerable extent palm oil, sometimes rubber. Those are things where on-site processing can be very valuable. And in those cases, absolutely, having a nucleus estate or plantation that operates that machinery with the scale economy, that can make it possible to have a tea plantation, a sugar operation, and so forth, where otherwise it wouldn't be possible. But if it's about something that's divisible, that can be divided, subdivided onto smaller and smaller plots, such as seed, fertilizer, water, agronomy, and marketing, then the evidence is overwhelming that an inclusive strategy with owner-operated, self-motivated household farming units, family farms, because of that self-motivation and local knowledge, they know what's happening on their plot every day from the before dawn to after sunset, and they can anticipate variation in soil moisture, they can anticipate variation in pest pressure. That's what's driven the overwhelming transition in places that used to have slavery or serfdom or colonial control of labor, in systems that employed layers of supervisors to try to force workers to keep tropical crops like coffee and cocoa on plantations. Those have all given way to family operations. So those nucleus and mechanized systems, if they're just displacing smallholders, will not lead to sustainable economic development unless there's a scale economy to be had, right? Some kind of machinery at the heart of it. Because fields don't offer scale economies, right? Fields are just one field after another, after another, after another, and you double the cost when you double the area. A machine grows in its volume or throughput with the cube of its capacity, as opposed to the cost growing just with the surface. So a square of its diameter or something. And that's the fundamental reason why machines are a source of scale economy and investor-owned businesses with hired labor, whereas farming is a family enterprise.
So that's another interesting one. So and as I was hearing you talk, and you were talking really about many of the bigger, tradable commodities, oil palm, tea, and the like, which are often thought of as sort of plantation crops. So in these systems in the drier savanna areas, what I was starting to think, well, maybe that model wouldn't work there. But at the same time, you do see increasingly tractors being used for mechanization, for ploughing, and for transport across the villages. And I wonder then, would you see then as that switch to mechanization from ox ploughing and the like to be one possible use of machines in your story, which would actually lead then to more sort of economies of scale and allow that type of system to work? Or do you think that this idea of the African Development Bank to switch those drier savanna areas with cotton and cereal production is fundamentally flawed?
So this is a tremendously important debate where the belief in scale economies for broadacre field crops rests on the observation that farmers who have mechanized systems with large acreage are wealthy. And of course that's true, but that's because they own all that land or they own all that machinery and they're wealthy people to begin with. The question for governments in a savanna, for governance and governments in a savanna type region is what will happen to the rural people who have no choice but to work somewhere in agriculture if they allow a few operators to run big mechanized systems over the available land.
Yeah.
What will happen to those people?
Sure.
Because at the levels of rural population growth that are inevitable, those people will, if you follow if these places follow a Latin American path, they would crowd into the sort of peri-urban slum periphery of cities with peri-urban agriculture and very, very bad environmental consequences, terrible poverty, and enormous social conflict that Latin America has seen. If they follow a Asian model, those people might remain in rural areas, but as rural landless. So keeping people employed in production is not only equitable, it's also efficient, because it turns out that mechanization rarely improves yields. It improves the amount of acreage that one person can cover without having to supervise. But the stakes at introducing so mechanized transportation is a great benefit even for smallholders. That's tremendously valuable even for a very smallholder. Mechanized plowing, if it involves things like sort of laser leveling or mechanized development of microcatchment or rock bund, a Zai system in Burkina, something that would involve improved water and soil conservation through use of machinery, including laser leveling. All that can be very consistent with an equitable repartition of land, so that people do have access to the employment they need.
So I'm going to start pushing some of the questions that are coming in your way. So one of them here was that a question whether there are ways to equitably increase access to mechanization. I think you were touching on that just now, really. How do you avoid winners and losers in that game? Maybe, in a sense, your last comments really address that.
Absolutely, yes. So so I think the key point is not to allow, and certainly not to subsidize. I mean, the real drama here is elites in government effectively subsidizing themselves or other elites to have internal land grabs facilitated by mechanization, where elites are able to maintain control over large amounts of rural land only because they're able to mechanize the farming. If they had to supervise smallholders with oxen, they wouldn't be able to maintain control. So,
Sure.
you know, I think the first point is don't subsidize machinery, large-scale plowing machinery, field crop preparation. Instead, look for mechanization of the labor bottlenecks. This is really crucial, right? Where we identify certain labor bottlenecks that, you know, for example, drying and harvesting to avoid post-harvest losses. For example, laser leveling and soil and water conservation through catchment. Those kinds of mechanization are tremendously valuable for landscape evolution to go from large farms with long fallows and widespread public open grazing to increasingly small farms with crop livestock integration and both inorganic and organic fertilizers raising yields, as well as labor being absorbed by the animal system, with markets for eggs, markets for milk, markets for meat. You know, unless governments recognize that poor rural people have no choice but to work in agriculture, and so absorbing workers is a crucial function. It's very hard to push back against elites who seek to control rural land through mechanization. But that is what it is. When people want a tractor subsidy, when they want long-term leases on land, they will promise high productivity, but it comes at the cost of rural poverty.
Sure. Really interesting points. Now, there's a series of questions coming in. One here. When it comes to lifting resource-poor smallholders out of poverty, should governments invest in agronomy, education, infrastructure, markets, or what? What would your first choice be, Will?
Yeah, this is definitely an all of the above situation where these things are complements. These things are multiple sides of scissors that where you can't say one blade of the scissors does the cutting. Rural people need education in order to make use of innovations in agronomy so that they can have transportation on rural infrastructure to bring things in and out. And those are manifested in markets. So a government that tries to do just a few things will find sharply diminishing gains from them. Many African countries have found that road building is tremendously valuable, and others have built roads on which people walk because the other complements just aren't there yet. So I think governance is a matter of identifying each need and gradually building up the set of rural development enabling environments, as the questioner asks, that are in the first instance agronomic, just what to do with land and water and forest resources, how to integrate animals, and move from the extensive history of Africa, you know, a great and frankly noble history of very extensive use of the low population density Africa, in which people needed to have a lot of mobility for agropastoralists to move around and work the land together, to evolving imperative to be much more densely populated in rural areas, which in the face of climate change is all the harder and requires a lot of agronomic innovation, as well as the infrastructure, market development, and so forth. So it's an all of the above situation.
So I think there are a couple of other questions here. One from Natalia Palacios, who's asking about really about how do we reach the poorest of the poor, and another one, Maria Spink, who's saying, well, if it's so hard to change the trajectories of change for rural poor, well, how do you stop rural landlessness? Is that just education? I mean, it's going a bit deeper, I think, into the things you've been touching on already. And is in the end, is sustainable intensification going to hack it for the poorest of the poor?
Right. No, I think it's very important to be asking that question and recognizing its importance. That as every innovation and opportunity comes along, only some group of people will be lucky enough to own that land in that circumstance, have those animals to take advantage of it, and there will be people left behind. Now, I think it's so important to remember that the overall context for the bulk of Africa, not everywhere, but a majority of the continent, is now roughly 15 years into the takeoff of Africa's Green Revolution after 2000, after the devastating years of the 70s and 80s, and the sort of partial uneven recoveries of the 90s. Since 2000, so roughly 18 years into, depending on the place, to different degrees, an extraordinary renaissance and the rise of new crop variety adoption, increased intensification, improved market access, improved governance in many parts of Africa. So on the whole, the pockets of extreme poverty are shrinking. Yeah. They may not be shrinking in absolute terms, but they're shrinking as a share. And that enables the rise of a whole new thing in Africa, which is actually being able to do the PRSP program in Ethiopia, the productive safety net program that enables the poorest of the poor to have access to employment and to income transfers. So even if they don't have land and own no livestock, there is something that they can do to sustain the floor of living standards. Sure. So I think it's not possible to think about rural development in Africa and poverty reduction in the Sustainable Development Goals without recognizing the core role for cash transfers, food for work, cash for work, that is at the heart of equitable economic development. Those are not band-aids that are temporary. The richest countries in the world have them. Yeah. They are an essential part of maintaining a vibrant economy, is to provide that safety net at the bottom. And that safety net at the bottom can rise gradually and help those who do have opportunities because of land ownership, livestock ownership, and education to take advantage of market opportunities. Yeah. If you don't have the safety net, it's very hard for the rest to grow.
Yeah, I think these are really important points. So you're really talking about the need for some forms of social protection, safety nets for the poorest of the poor, because basically sustainable intensification of agriculture on its own is not really going to address those issues. I think that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can think of development as a kind of multidimensional set of curves in time, and also distributions in the population, where what the local community, including governments, local government and national governments, are able to do in terms of safety nets and social insurance, social protection for the bottom, really helps to lift up the whole distribution of others. We found that cash transfers enable rural entrepreneurship. Social safety nets enable risk-taking, enable people to and create the markets that allow others to use the land and labor that they might have very productively.
So a follow-up question from Maria is, can you give some examples of governments which you think have maybe been successful with their agricultural policies? So you mentioned Ethiopia, which is often held up as a country, I think, with fairly rapid agricultural growth and productivity growth over the past years. But are there other examples as well of countries where you think that they've been successful with their agricultural policies?
Sure. I mean, Rwanda is often cited as a great case in point, and several others. I think I want to be, the first thing I want to say though is, I'm speaking from the United States, where the United States is a country that had one of the first major sort of democratic constitutions in the world, tremendous success with a number of very important institutions, and then having just huge challenges to maintaining that. And I think similar trajectories of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, success in one area, but not another. We all have to be really humble about whether any one country is a role model for everything.
Yeah.
We need to be drawing examples from here, there, and somewhere else. Where go to Dar es Salaam, there's a pretty good urban bus system.
Yeah.
You go to Addis, there's an interesting urban tram. You go to other societies, they'll have very good water management, for example.
Yeah, sure.
The idea that there's one great success story, I think, is a pernicious and unhelpful approach. There are no heroes in every dimension. We just need to learn from each other as a global community.
We've got a number of other questions I'd like to bring on. I've got an eye on the time, so we've only got really another 5 minutes or so to go. Michelle Monroy is asking for publications on safety nets and social protection, but I guess we can maybe put some of those on a discussion forum afterwards. You mentioned the United States, and there was a question earlier which was saying, well, what about access to farming, getting into farming? Even in the US, many young people say they'd love to farm, but they can't get into farming. So how can we address this issue of the aging of farmers on the one hand, where we see inexorably all across the world farming not being particularly popular and farmers getting older and older and older? And yet there are some younger people who love to get into farming and they don't have the opportunity. Do you have some suggestions there?
I think the main suggestion is realism. So after university, I went to teach secondary school in Zimbabwe, where every single one of my several hundred students, I was teaching in a rural area, every single one of them grew up on farms and wanted to leave them. And then I was teaching at American Agricultural University, where only about 1/10 of my students had grown up on a farm, but about half of them would have loved to get into farming if they could. Yeah. The difference, of course, is that in America, farmers are richer than non-farmers. And in Africa, in Zimbabwe and much of Africa, all of Africa, they're quite a bit poorer, poorer than other people in their society. And it's only very recently that American farmers became richer than non-farmers. But everywhere in the world, whether it's those Zimbabwean settings or all the way through to the United States, most farmers are children of farmers. The cost of buying land, acquiring land, is almost always more than one can pay back to a bank loan, for example. So people have had to inherit land, inherit lives, inherit an operation. There are exceptions, but very few, meaning that roughly 90% of farmers are people who grew up on farms and inherited the land, inherited the skills, the techniques, and so forth. It's just being realistic about this is the most important thing. In the United States, because we've had rapid growth in farm technology and opportunities, we haven't on average had any decline in the number of farmers, any significant decline. We've had some, but it hasn't been anything since the 90s, since farm and non-farm incomes roughly equalized. So once one recognizes that agriculture is a vocation that people are born into because they inherited land, inherited a rural livelihood, and the question is how best to serve that rural agricultural population, we understand farming, I think, in a much better, clearer way.
Yeah. So there's a point here. Nikesha Davis Shank says, to retain youth in rural farming, is there a benefit of adding robotics and data-driven automation? I think, again, you hinted at that, I think, in the last couple of sentences you were saying, sort of making life on land more attractive and modern, I guess, through using robotics, automation as a way of encouraging youth to stay in the farming community.
So this is actually a very important, good note to perhaps end on. We unfortunately started late because of the technical problem, but if we do want to end at 11, this
Sure.
could be a good last question, which is Nikesha's observation is just tremendously important, where drones above ground, and then as well as remote sensing from satellites above ground, and then continuous monitoring and application of water for irrigation systems, as well as nutrients and fertilization and pest control and weed control. So variable rate monitoring, variable rate application, and continuous time sensors offer the possibility for the first time of remote controlled agriculture, where the family farming model could be broken. And it could be broken by this possibility of algorithmic farming, farming by algorithm, farming by computer, which was never possible before because you needed a family farmer on site to feel the soil, smell the air, have a spot the pests, spot the rust on a plant early, and know what action to take based on their understanding of that particular place and time. And if this modern high-tech agriculture, ag tech, takes off, then that does profoundly change rural development and potentially spell an end to the long era of family farming, because it would be possible for a firm, a company, to farm vast acreage by computer. So I think there's a lot of tech in agriculture that's consistent with family farming that would involve some of the things we've mentioned already, like laser leveling, and most of that tech is genetics. So the billions and billions of dollars of R&D in modern crop seeds, that's the real thing that has brought late 20th and 21st century technology. If Africa can not only have access to state-of-the-art genetics through conventional breeding, but also increasingly gene editing to have faster and faster development of more location-specific new varieties. Crop genetics are the highest of high tech, embodied in an inexpensive seed that gets multiplied by local seed companies, local seed multiplication. But genetics is the highest of high tech, and then bringing in laser leveling, remote sensing, bringing in, but if it's consistent with family farming, then it's consistent with rural employment and inclusive rural development. But if it becomes something where a big man, a big woman can control vast acreage with computing and hired labor, then Africa faces a demographic challenge of absorbing workers without having their own farm that's actually unprecedented in history. That would be a nightmare scenario. I don't think it's likely, because farming by algorithm has not displaced family farmers even where it's most mature, meaning the United States Midwest, where people have enormous troves of data and a very precise application and sensing, so that precision agriculture is the norm across the US Midwest. But it's so far not induced any of these millionaire landowners to get off their own tractor.
Sure.
They drive their own multi-million-dollar rig with its full complement of electronics. because they're not quite ready to fly by wire. They're not ready to give up personal oversight of their farm. And so far, all of this tech has been consistent with family farming. But the day that it becomes possible to run, 500,000 or 1 million acres from a console with computer screens, then we're in a different world. But I don't think that's happening yet. So
it's not happening yet. And then, of course, the big question is, what do we want, isn't it? Anyway, I think we need to wind up there, Will. Real fun to talk to you. And I hope that different course participants will follow up on some of the discussion boards, and we'll be able to post some references there if there are particular topics. So thanks from my side. Thanks to you, Will. Really interesting discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken. And thanks to all the participants online.